From the studios of Clean Fuels Alliance America, this is the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast. Fascinating ideas and conversations in the world of biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel. Now, here's your host, Scott Tremaine.
And welcome. This week, a Clean Fuels Roundtable on sustainable aviation fuel with CEO Donnell Rehagen, Director of Economics and Market Analytics Jonathan Martin, and Director of Environmental Science Veronica Bradley.
Well, hey, thanks, Scott, for that. I appreciate it. And Jonathan, Veronica, thanks for joining us. This is going to be a fun conversation because it's a very, very timely topic. We're going to be talking about sustainable aviation fuel. And so we all know as an industry, SAF has kind of been a later comer, but it's certainly got a lot of momentum. And so I thought it'd be great to kind of take our listeners through a little bit of some of the basics as we work our way up into maybe a deeper conversation in a follow-up podcast. But so my thought is maybe we just start with the very, very, very basics. What is SAF? Veronica, what is SAF? You've spent some time in the airline industry and working with them on environmental work and bringing SAF to fruition as a part of that. So what is SAF?
Yeah, thanks for that, Donnell, and thanks for having me today. So I think we were joking a little bit before we started recording that, depending on who you talk to, you might get a different definition. Yeah. But for the airline industry, they've really been thinking about SAF as sustainable aviation fuel. They started talking about it as alternative jet fuel back in the day, I'll say, in the mid to late noughts. But now they've kind of solidified as an industry around sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, and really focused on renewable feedstocks providing the source of energy for jet fuel. So not relying on fossil fuel would be, I think, the easiest way to put that. And so then you have a whole plethora of renewable fuels that, folks like in our audience who are familiar with biodiesel or renewable diesel pathways, it's similar, but then even more expansive based on a whole variety of other technologies that can convert those feedstocks into fuel.
So when you think about sustainable aviation fuel, it's obviously different from jet fuel. That's the whole reason why it's growing in demand and growing in popularity, right? And I know, Jonathan, you've spent time in oil refining and producing jet fuel among the many products that oil refineries. So tell us a little bit about the difference. I mean, what is the real difference between jet fuel and sustainable aviation fuel?
There's not a whole lot of difference. They're very similar products. The main difference between the two is that there are, getting into my chemical engineering background, I apologize. Most of the sustainable aviation fuel that's out there on the market as of today, and most of that's being kind of planned for production, is more paraffinic in nature, and paraffinic just means long straight chain molecules, whereas out of petroleum you get that, but you also get these aromatic compounds that are basically big. Think of big hexagons, right? And so one of the main differences between them is that when it comes to the engines, as of right now, our technical team has been telling us that aromatic compounds are very big, and they're kind of needed in order for the O-rings and everything inside the plane to not have any sort of issues. And so there's been some blending constraints as of right now on sustainable aviation fuel into jet fuel. However, there's been a whole bunch of tests with new technologies to create new aromatic compounds to blend in as well. And so we'll see where those come in the future. Again, that's more of a deep dive analysis, but as of just from a top line number, there's a little bit of a difference. And so there's a kind of a limitation on blending as of right now. And airlines are hoping to remove that in the near term.
Yeah. So I'd say to add to that, amongst all of these different pathways and conversion processes for producing SAF to produce what we call neat SAF, so 100% SAF, you have layered on top of that, to Jonathan's point, this blending aspect, so that the whole suite of properties that the jet fuel has comports with ASTM standards. And so you have anywhere between kind of a 5% to a 50% blending limit, depending on what the fuel conversion process and pathway is.
So, Veronica, again, with your background working with the airlines, what's one of the things that I've noticed as a guy who's been in the industry long enough to have been somewhat close to the origins of biodiesel and now very close to the origins of SAF. In the early days of biodiesel, it was harder to find customers who really wanted the fuel. They've come to love it, by the way. But the SAF seemed to start the opposite way. Really that the airlines and the airline manufacturers, we're all like, we really want to make this happen. It's almost like it's been a pull as much as a push. I mean, do you know what kind of what their thought process was, or why the airlines are all about SAF?
Yeah. So, I mean, before I started with the airlines, which I started at Airlines for America in 2016. So even well before that, they were working on research with the FAA, with the Department of Navy, and other federal agencies to kind of test this sort of thing out. And I think it really comes down to those environmental attributes of the fuel, of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. While I was there, we started talking about, how do we get in alignment with science-based initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to mitigate climate change. And it was really kind of a wild ride because we've been doing this work, kind of thinking about what's the trajectory, trying to make SAF happen, but not with any sort of urgency necessarily, but taking those kind of slow steps to standardization and quality and building up the industry kind of from the bottom. But then in 2018, a lovely high school student in Sweden named Greta Thunberg started the flight shame movement, popularized it, and scared the bejesus out of the airline industry. And so it really, if people want to be cynical about what she did or did not do, but she got the eyes and ears of some airline CEOs. And so then it was like full steam ahead. And it was, okay, how do we decarbonize? What do we do about SAF? And when you look at the pathway to decarbonization, it relies on liquid fuel. I mean, we talk about all of the different industries that biodiesel and renewable diesel have because of that extra power that's really needed, whether it's rail or marine or heavy duty trucking. It's the same thing with aviation, but you have that extra dimension of getting out of the air and staying out of the air. And so that energy density that liquid fuel provides that batteries can't provide to date is really like the motive to have the whole industry come together and bring it to fruition. And just as like a fun anecdotal story that I love to think about kind of energy density of liquid fuel, because I am, unlike Jonathan, not an engineer. I asked a Boeing colleague once, could you electrify an aircraft? What does that mean? And he said, okay, well, we could today take batteries, shove them into a 737 and fly it across the Atlantic. But the batteries would take up the entire inside of the fuselage. So nobody would be flying on that plane. No cargo would be on that plane. And as you flew across the Atlantic Ocean, you would have to throw out the spent batteries because one of the benefits of liquid fuel is when you combust it, there is no weight still. So that gives an idea of how far away we are really from electrifying the aviation industry and why they're really all in on sustainable aviation fuel.
Well, when you said we could do that, I was definitely thinking we doesn't count me. I would not want to be in that plane trying to see if we could get a battery-powered plane across the Atlantic. I enjoy swimming, but not from heights, but for sure. But
I'm sure my Boeing colleagues are saying, royal we, not him either.
But in all seriousness, it does go back to where the airlines find themselves if they are going to decarbonize. Liquid renewable fuels is that probably at the moment for sure the only mechanism, and so that probably is the short answer to why the airlines and airline manufacturers are coming on strong, coming on fast to sustainable aviation fuel. So
and to add to that too, I would also say that a lot of their when you look at how these airlines are structured, right? So let's just talk about passengers. I'm not going to talk about cargo, but talk about passengers, right? Most of them, excluding Southwest, use a hub and spoke model, right? And so Essentially, that means they have central locations with longer flights, right, from those central locations. And so let's say you're flying Delta. That's why like everyone flies through Detroit and Atlanta if you're on the eastern side of the U.S., right, because those are the hubs, and then flying to everywhere else with the spokes. And so having liquid fuels also helps them maintain that. Whereas if they had to switch to say all electric or something, they may have to do a bunch of shorter flights, and so you'd have a lot more, having to walk through every airport and make sure you can, get from one flight to another. And so that's one thing that might make it a little bit easier on them keeping liquid fuels as well. If you think about it on top is just how these companies are structured, so they don't have to re-change everything from a capital perspective.
Yeah, and I mean the technology for aircraft, right? The number 2 or number 1 cost for an airline is fuel. So like they are trying to eke out every fuel efficiency gain they already can and have been for a long time now. The pandemic was actually like a bit of a silver lining for them to get rid of old aircraft, to buy new aircraft, to right size and have the most fuel efficiency possible. So it's really, they're trying all the other ways that they can to eke out emission reductions, but they recognize that liquid fuel is the foreseeable future for decarbonizing the airline industry based on the institutional investors that help fund their operations.
So how big of a job, is this decarbonization? I mean, when we talk about the airlines, and let's just, for clarity, we'll just talk about domestically, but how much jet fuel is consumed domestically? Jonathan, I mean, is that a...
Yeah, I'll take that.
Yeah.
Jet fuel, looking at IEA's data, the International Energy Agency, from 2022, is about 24 billion gallons of jet fuel was consumed inside the U.S. I was just quickly before this, I went ahead and looked up some global data as well, just to give you some scope. Looking at that data, IATA was estimating that there was going to be about 99 billion gallons consumed of jet fuel this year in 2024. And then IEA was forecasting even higher than that, about 120 billion gallons of globally of jet fuel. And so that, wow, these are really large numbers. And so obviously there's a lot to move. And it's not just passenger aircraft, right? So like, as I mentioned earlier, there's cargo and all that as well. But the U.S. is a significant portion of it, right? It's about 25% or so.
Yeah, and that's like billions with a B, while SAF production is, millions with an M.
Yeah.
So we're orders of magnitude away from providing that supply.
So we're in 2024, who's leading the production of SAF? Is it the United States? Is it the European Union? Is it specific countries around the world? Everybody? I mean, who's really being looked at right now as leading the charge for SAF on a global perspective?
I mean, the two markets that are leading are ones you already mentioned, right? The U.S. and the EU are the two main markets. Now, they have two different approaches about going about it. We can talk about that later maybe. But to answer your question, right, is I would say the U.S. is probably the main driver right now, but, Europe's not too far away. For example, Neste recently announced in their earnings call that they're converting part of their Rotterdam renewable diesel facility to SAF production because there's such huge demand for SAF in Europe. And then also in the United States, in the fourth quarter of 24, Diamond Green Diesel will be converting part of their Port Arthur, Texas facility over to sustainable aviation fuel. And, it's going to be 250 million gallons of production of SAF. And so that's a, very large volume, and they're going to be targeting both the U.S. and EU markets.
Yeah, I think historically, Neste and World Energy were kind of the only two real commercial volume suppliers that anybody talked about. But, we've got people coming online now and, according to their projections, very soon. So I think there'll be a much more diverse portfolio in the near term.
So speaking of projections, I mean, because we are talking about trying to, I heard Jonathan talk about 24 billion gallons in the United States, maybe 100 billion gallons globally. That's a huge volume. I mean, what is the What's it look like 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? I mean, is there a confidence level that there's enough new production being planned and, legitimate that we're going to see those numbers grow, I'll just say exponentially over a 3 year, 5 year, 10 year, or is there going to be a little bit of a delay before things pick up?
It's starting to happen now. Obviously, it's going to take a while to ramp up. There's just there's a huge need for it, and it's going to continue to grow. If you keep looking at this, there's a lot of projects, and the vast majority of them are probably starting next year through 2027. So as you said, in those next 3 years, there's a lot of projects projected to come online. A bunch of different technologies, right? So not everybody's going to be playing in the same space in SAF. Unlike when you talk about renewable diesel and biodiesel, where everyone's kind of in the lipid feedstock world, and when you go over to the SAF space, there's many other technologies, right? And so alcohol to jet is one that our ethanol friends are very excited about. LanzaJet just opened up their facility, first facility, commercial facility, I should say, in Soperton, Georgia, earlier this year, and it's starting to ramp up due to some environmental concerns. I'm sure Veronica could talk to it more than I can, but they're having to use sugarcane ethanol rather than corn ethanol. I'm not sure the specifics behind the reasoning for that, but I know that there's a CI score reason. It's going to continue to grow. Alcohol to jet is something that, like I said, our ethanol friends are very, very excited about. Whether they can get the CI score down, carbon capture, or otherwise, we'll see. HEFA, which is hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids, for those who don't know, that's pretty much the same process that is used for renewable diesel today. There's going to be a lot of conversions you're going to likely start seeing here soon, and also expansions to create more sustainable aviation fuel production. And I think that HEFA is going to be the main driver in the near term, even up through 10 years, and then once you get past 10 years, then there's some really green, brand new technologies that we might start seeing enter the marketplace. Europe is looking at mandating some of them to be used. So we'll see if they ever come to the U.S., but they'll definitely be in Europe because of the mandates.
This is the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast. Fascinating ideas and conversations in the world of biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel.
Again, I'm Donnell Rehagen, and we're speaking with Veronica Bradley, Jonathan Martin, about sustainable aviation fuel. And so, again, the outlook is very positive. As I mentioned earlier, the advantage SAF producers have is a willing customer base. In fact, I guess it seems to me like there's more demand right now than there is fuel. And we've talked a little bit about where the fuel's coming from and what the next several years look like. But Veronica, from the airlines' perspective, I mean, is that an accurate assessment that they can't get as much as they'd like to be getting at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're certainly trying to figure out ways to get more volumes. But I think, that all of that with like a very important asterisk, as I mentioned earlier, fuel is one of their top two costs. And so they want to see the volumes, but they want to see them in the most cost competitive way possible. If that includes the stacking of different policies to create that price parity, so be it. That's why you see them very strong in support of different policies to create that cost competition between petroleum jet fuel and SAF. But yeah, I mean, I think that they're very interested in the ways to grow the market in a way that they can continue to kind of take commodity pricing.
Well, you talked about the policy, and just like for biodiesel and renewable diesel, policy and support are critical, not just to kind of make the production of the fuel practical, but also to make the consumption, the use of the fuel. I mean, the airlines, as you said, it's one of their largest costs. They don't want to see that go up. So they're looking for those opportunities to partner with agencies and governments that want to see of that decarbonization happen and to help that along. And so we're seeing some of that at the federal level, right? I mean, we've recently gotten some insight into what the federal government's thinking about on the 40B. the guidance that we've gotten. Still a lot of work for us to kind of sort through that. So maybe we'll talk about that in more detail at a later podcast. But that's a critical piece that the industry, the production side, at least for sure, has been waiting for to see where those incentives are. We're also seeing a lot of activity at the state level, which is a little bit surprising to me that individual states start to pick and say, hey, we want to incentivize SAF use in our state or at these major airports in our state. I understand why, but it's a little surprising. So you start adding all of that together and the package of incentives can become substantial. So I don't know to what extent, Veronica, you feel like that how critical that is to really seeing that next boost, not just of production, but of use at the airline level.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is absolutely critical. I mean, we know, as Jonathan was saying, talking about the carbon intensity of these different fuels and those CI scores, all of these incentive programs that we have right now, there is some level of the environmental attribute determining that return. So, whether it's qualifying under the RFS generally to generate a RIN, or California LCFS, the various state level LCFS programs that are, more of a sliding scale of how much value you get is based on that CI score. They're really looking toward being able to capitalize maximize those environmental benefits, because that's really the angle that they're taking and approaching on all of this, right? It's not just, we're consuming SAF. I mean, granted, their 2030 goals are SAF goals, not emission reduction goals. So there is plenty of flexibility in the near term on how much environmental benefit they get. But they are supportive of, the more they can eke out of the fuel for the cost, the better, so that they can really get to those long-term 2050 or for some airlines even 2040 carbon neutral goals.
Yeah, not even just the LCFS programs. I know you just mentioned that. There are actually some other states as well who don't have LCFS programs trying to promote it as well through just credits. $1 per gallon or $1.25 or 75 cents in the case of Nebraska, which I think is the most recent one, right? So that was just signed into law. So that's all really, really interesting. And like I said, there's a whole bunch of cases, and I don't think that most people would think of Nebraska as being somebody who would be incentivizing SAF. But it's got the chance, and any benefit and help to the industry is always welcome, right? So
yeah, and again, it goes back to the airlines. Are very supportive of this and are working with their the legislatures in the states where they have a presence, which every state has multiple airports, right? And trying to make a difference and work alongside and partner with to try to bring more of this product into play sooner rather than later. So I think it's a perfect play. If I was leading their team, I'd be encouraging that kind of play totally. Yeah. So it's totally understandable.
Yeah, and I would say, I think if you think about it like from our perspective too, right, the fuel, the economic benefit of having fuel production in your home state, right, all of those added jobs and added economic value. I think it's the same thing for the airlines, where you have, you see Illinois doing that. O'Hare is a massive airport. Midway is a massive airport. And so you have the economic value and of the interest of the aviation industry in your home state. And so they have that kind of, you can be skeptical and call it power, however you want to talk about it, but that influence to help support the industry because of those tight relationships and the economic interests of the individual states.
Well, and Veronica, you know better than most, being our director of environmental science. I mean, the EJ communities that are surrounding these airports as well are beginning to have a lot more to say about what's happening at the airports, and rightfully so when you look at the health impacts of some of these emissions for years and years and decades and decades. And so the airlines, again, wanting to be a friendly neighbor, a more friendly neighbor. It's a wonderful move, for them to be part of that, trying to make things better.
Yeah, and I think it's also part of our entire fuel suite too. If we think of airports are hubs of economic activity, you have aircraft, but you also have logistics providers, you have passengers, and so all of the fuels that we can displace fossil fuel with can really kind of gather around the airport and provide those benefits. I think similar to biodiesel, what we see is SAF, it lowers PM emissions, and so you have those air quality benefits. Now, it's a little bit different for aviation because you get a little bit of the benefit from the landing and takeoff for the community around. But it also creates a benefit in the air because it prevents contrail formation. And I don't want to get too wonky because I think there's still a lot of research to be done, but there is concern that those contrails also contribute substantially to greenhouse gas emissions, at least for the aviation industry, right, as part of their impacts on climate change.
So when you talk about the overall effort for airlines, and when we think of airlines, I, of course, always think of passenger airlines, but there's a lot of transportation of goods that move. We talk about that in our smaller circles here at Clean Fuels and within our industry is how many goods that we as U.S. consumers acquire. Maybe it's Amazon dropping off on our doorstep, but those goods originated in a country across the ocean. And so they either came over on a vessel or they came over on a plane. And from there, they moved to maybe a rail and moved to a warehouse by truck, and from truck to. So you're exactly right. We've got all of these fuels, with biodiesel, renewable diesel, and now sustainable aviation fuel to try to help to decarbonize all of that transportation. But those, I'll call them the movers of goods, they have a job to accomplish too when they've got customers that want them to be part of their corporate decarbonization. So, if I'm, Amazon or whatever, trying to move goods all around the world, SAF has to become part of that equation because there's just not really another option when you look at the airline transportation and moving of goods.
Yeah, I mean, there's, on the cargo side, certainly the major players in that environment. I mean, to be honest, passenger airlines, it's not just your bags that go underneath the aircraft. It's also cargo. So there are whole divisions of cargo operations for passenger airlines. But certainly, the FedEx, the UPS, DHL, all of those guys are very interested in that. And it's the people who purchase those goods want to make sure that those goods have lower carbon intensity. On the passenger side, it's those huge consulting firms like Deloitte or, firms like Microsoft.
McKinsey.
Who want McKinsey, all those guys who want their business travel, which is going to be the overwhelming majority of their emissions, to also be reduced, because again, there is this drive for net zero carbon in 2050, and you do a greenhouse gas inventory for a company, and they, if you're white collar pushing paper and not really contributing to tangible goods, you're using that intellectual property or what have you. It's that business travel, it's that moving of your people around that really impacts your emissions, and so you have an interest as well. And so there are alliances that are coming up that are, pooling together and saying, okay, well, how do we help the airlines lower their emissions? And the airlines say, help us buy SAF. So then the airlines can socialize that cost some. So you've got the policy side of things and all of those price competition levers that we know for our other fuels, but we also have this added kind of voluntary space of socializing the cost to indirect consumers of the fuel.
So we're going to close up here quickly, probably, but I did want to circle back to something, Jonathan, you spoke about earlier, because it's probably left some folks wondering or maybe wanting more. We haven't really talked that much about feedstocks, the feedstocks that make up SAF currently. We talked about it a little bit, but you talked about alcohol to jet. As kind of being one of those, maybe in some of the out years, having huge potential. So how does the technology of conversion of those feedstocks, how does that factor into kind of where most of this SAF is going to come from 3, 5, 10 years out?
That's a great question, obviously. Going back to the CI score discussion, right? Essentially, as we've been discussing, right, airlines want to lower their CI scores as much as they possibly can. And so they're looking at any means to do that. But when you talk about the different processes, and so if we're going to stick talking about agricultural feedstocks, such as soybean oil on the lipid side or even waste oils, if you think about that HEFA process that I highlighted before, right, essentially you take long chain molecules and you're cutting them down to size, right? And so you're just trying to target the jet fuel size. Whereas ethanol to jet is the opposite, right? Ethanol is really small chain, and you try to build it up into the right size. And so they're essentially opposite processes, right? One's cutting down these very long chains, the other one's growing it, and they're basically both trying to target SAF production in this case. And obviously what's going to drive the difference between the two is going to be a lot of costs, right? It's going to be what's the cheapest to produce, and can they get the value from the CI score and from credits in order to offset any higher costs they may have for those processes. And when we get even further out, past 10 years into further into the future, you may start seeing woody biomass or municipal solid waste being used. There's different processes to take those and convert them. Cellulosic agriculture could play a piece as well. And you get even further out, you start talking about power to liquids and those different processes. Don't want to get too far in the weeds, but essentially, it's taking green hydrogen, green methanol, and then converting that over to sustainable aviation fuel. But yeah, so it's all going to come down to costs, especially on the feedstock side. And it's going to be, if you think about it, right, if you can get wood waste using just basic model, right, wood waste essentially would be free, right? Because right now they just burn it out of to try to maintain so the forests don't have wildfires and everything, right? So they just burn that waste, and you could possibly take that wood waste in and use it. However, that's not that simple, right? There's a bunch of other things, and the process is really expensive. So they're working on different ways to offset that. But that's just one idea as an example. But yeah, it's all going to come down to costs on which one wins out. As of right now, it looks like the HEFA process is going to be likely the vast majority of the SAF for a while. Alcohol to jet will start coming in pretty soon, I think in the next 5 years, and then we'll see where that levels out. And then after that, that's when you get into these bigger ideas.
Yeah, Department of Energy says that in 2030, about 90% of the SAF is going to be HEFA SAF, and then the balance will be mostly that alcohol or ethanol to jet. And I know that, from a research standpoint, there's a collective interest in that ethanol, alcohol to jet pathway, because the supply feels pretty ready, at least in the United States, right? If you expect demand destruction with electrification of on-road vehicles, then you've kind of what do you do with that ethanol? And so you kind of have this stranded asset that now has a new home. But the biggest piece of that then is reducing that CI score, because ethanol as a feedstock is already pretty carbon intensive. To then use that and go through a whole nother conversion process to make another fuel. So yeah, it's really that nexus of cost and CI score to get you there.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how sustainable agricultural practices are implemented into the CI scoring, and then also trying to figure out how ethanol can continue in their process, reducing their carbon intensity. And I know there's been a lot of talk about carbon capture, carbon pipelines, those sort of things. I know that there are a handful that do have carbon capture already, and they're kind of already positioned to be a little bit better off. One of our good friends in Decatur, Illinois, ADM, has a carbon capture facility in one of their facilities, and so they kind of have a leg up on others in the corn ethanol space on possibly producing SAF, whereas others who don't have it may struggle just from a CI score basis. But that's just one idea.
It sounds like the perfect topic for another podcast.
Well, I was just saying, you guys are teasing my tease, because I think we definitely, especially with the recent, guidance on 40B, I think we definitely need to bring, the two of you back together and have a conversation maybe in a couple of weeks or something, and as we have a chance to take a deeper dive into that guidance and see what that's really going to mean, because it should bring some clarity to these issues, especially alcohol to jet and climate smart agriculture. What impact that's going to have is something that they've started to define and try to bring clarity to. So you guys are willing to do that? Join me back in the studio maybe in a couple of weeks when we've had a chance to look at that.
Absolutely.
Pinky promise.
All right. Well, hey, thanks to both of you for taking some time out to visit with me and help our listeners learn a little bit more about sustainable aviation fuel. It's something we're very excited about at the trade association level, and just great to have both of you on the team and working for our industry. So thanks again for joining us here in the studio.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. That's it for this week's episode. If you enjoy the podcast and you've got a moment, it really does help us if you leave us a rating. It helps us grow and get more awareness in the podcast universe. And if you really want to go for it, just leave us a review, like this one from Roger Rick 17, who says, "Great insight on the challenges we face globally with experts that really know their stuff. It's very well done, and thanks for putting this together." Well, Roger Rick 17, thank you for putting that together. And if you leave us a review, we might just read it here too. So please go do that wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you have any questions for our experts or suggestions for future topics or guests, just email us at podcasts@cleanfuels.org. And join us next week for another episode of the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. To catch all the latest from Clean Fuels Alliance America, follow us at cleanfuels.org. The Better, Cleaner, Now podcast is a production of Clean Fuels Alliance America. That's all for us. Now it's your turn to be better, cleaner, now.